Good morning, and on behalf of Mobility Ways, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this latest Thought Leadership webinar. Many thanks for your participation. For those new to Mobility Ways, we are a leader in transport decarbonisation and the leader in tackling commuting emissions. Through tech tools and data analysis, we help organisations understand employee commuting habits, surface realistic sustainable travel potential, and evidence how and where transport systems might be improved to better serve travel to and from employment sites. The aim of these regular sessions is to support learning and invite collaboration on sustainable travel topics, typically with a focus on the workplace. Navigating the employer-employee dynamic is key. To operate responsibly, a business needs to engage its employees and, in the case of sustainable commuting, appeal to hearts and minds, i.e., be human-centred. And so, to today's webinar, which will delve into the system of travel and transport planning and the opportunity for psychology and design to deliver better outcomes for people and the planet, as covered in the book, Transport for Humans, Are We Nearly There Yet? Co-authored by Pete Dyson and Rory Sutherland, I'm delighted to be joined by both gentlemen today. Welcome.
Thank you very
Pete.
much.
Hello.
Pete and Rory are both experts in behavioural science, with Rory having co-founded the behavioural science practice within the marketing agency Ogilvy UK, and Pete then joining the practice before some years later taking up a principal behavioural scientist role at the Department of Transport. Pete will open today's session and provide context to the book's origin, the overall argument for a human-centred approach to transport, and commentary on the science of behavioural change. Rory will follow Pete to showcase how transport systems can be better geared towards making travel more enjoyable, with an emphasis on what planners, policymakers, and businesses can do to deliver meaningful and impactful change. The aim of this session is to leave you all with insights that we hope will change the way you view transport and actionable advice for enhancing the commuting experience within your place and/or organisation. Pete and Rory's presentation will last around an hour, leaving about 30 minutes for audience follow-up and questions, so please add your queries and comments as they come to you via the Q&A function. If we don't get to all questions during the webinar, we will follow up over email, plus with this session being recorded, a link to the video will be circulated. Importantly, with questions, do add your name. 10 copies of Transport for Humans are up for grabs today for those posting questions. Winners will be randomly selected after the webinar, hence why adding name is important. Right then, enough from me. Pete, over to you.
Thanks very much. Appreciate this session, and it's brilliant to mark actually 4 years on since the publication of the book. And in many ways, if you'd asked Rory and I 4 years ago if we'd be doing a session like this for Mobility Ways, still sharing the book, talking about its insights, we might have bitten your hand off, because it's been brilliant that this book has gained a lot of traction. We thought when writing it that we were coming at transport from a fresh angle, albeit as outsiders. And it's great that so many people in the UK, from policy to local government to just people who are passionate and keen about transport, those groups are not mutually exclusive, I can assure you, have read it and gained traction in shaping policy, not least next year in the UK, the Integrated National Transport Strategy, which we're really heartened has really this at its heart, of putting passengers first, putting people's needs first. So next slide, please. So Rory and I really came at this as outsiders, and the reason for that is there's no travel module in people's brains. There's no which mode shall I take, module or heuristic. Travel requires such a range of mental skills. So if you were to open the book up, you would find an opening that sets out the history and actually quite a nice way in which transport has started, thinking about people from the Victorians onwards, from the tube map that makes it easy to navigate, to really nice design elements, and then going through systematically what happens when people travel. How do we think about our mode choice? How do we navigate and orient? How do we think about value and tickets, given that we're thinking about these things in life more generally? How do we think about time and the perception of time and our habits? And for better or worse, how travel is in a way skillful and requires a range of different attributes to come together. I'm going to talk more about that on my section, and when I hand over to Rory, I suspect he'll go more into the psychology of when people design transport. And I bet many of you dialing in today have jobs that involve exactly this kind of skill set. So when we're faced with transport problems, how do we think we are solving them when we design towns and cities and villages and choose land use or locations for offices? And then, of course, how all those things are connected together. Because transport is very, very social. And, part of our thesis that I think loads of us agree with is transport's the glue that's holding society together. But unfortunately, it's a bit of an invisible glue. And it makes so much other stuff work. So whether your issue is the economy, society, sustainability, equity, we're passionate that transport has a really, really big role to play. So next slide. The key opening really is the very simple insight that people are not cargo, that for too long we've thought of transport as a simple activity of getting things and people from A to B. If we were cargo, it would be a much simpler problem to solve. But being human, we're faced with lots of choices about whether we board, choose the thing that we do, how we're packed together, how we experience something. So transport really has a people problem to solve. Secondly, and I think in particular in the past 5 or 10 years, there's been a tendency to characterize people who travel as customers or as drivers, passengers, as reducing people to road users or wheelchair users or cyclists. In truth, and I'll get to this later, people travel in many different ways, and many people are all of those things in a given day. And it really helps to think about the human or the common attributes we all share. We all have a brain on our shoulders, after all. And Rory and I come at it from a psychology point, so how brains work and how bodies function. Next slide, please. And yet, we are all human, but that does not mean we are all equal, at least not under the eyes of the current transport systems we face. There are persistent inequalities in transport, and I have 3 to share, but I'm sure you know many more. 1 in 5 people in the UK have a condition that makes travel challenging. 15 to 20% of people live in areas of transport-related social exclusion. So the nature of their location means they're deprived of access to so many things. And on commuting, some 57% of people who currently commute by private vehicle believe it would be very difficult to find an alternative mode of transport, which means we can't simply keep bashing our heads and saying that people might just choose differently because they don't have access and they won't be able to change. So both the system and the individual needs to change around us. Next slide. It helps, therefore, to get an understanding of what people want. So we want to understand people's needs, but we also need to understand their wants as well. This was a nice, broad, simple national survey done in December of the year before last by IPPR. And it's nice because it presents the overwhelming conclusion that people do want more public transport to be more convenient, affordable, and accessible. They also want to make driving and parking more convenient and affordable, and the list goes on. It's cut across by different segments of the UK population, slightly politically, but also that cuts by where people are located. But I think the central message is that people want a lot from their transport system, and it struck Rory and I that in many ways transport isn't working for a lot of people, and there's a lot to be gained from relatively straightforward ways in which we can think from end to end about the journey experience and how transport enables people's lives to go on. Next slide, please. A really important influence on our work has been really these 2 charts, which present a similar sort of wiggly line. The the direction of travel in transport is really a relatively steady amount of time spent traveling. This is from 2002 to present day, but it could have gone longer, and you would have seen a similar pattern. People spend on average 400 hours or so traveling every year, which is about an hour a day. And would you believe it? Even more than 100 years ago, the likes of, in the bottom right-hand corner, Marchetti and Zahavi and Lewis Mumford and Bertrand Russell were saying people travel on average about an hour a day. So there's a certain diet of travel that you're willing to fit within your lifestyle. Clearly, over that intervening period, travel has got a lot faster. It's got a lot better in many ways. It's got sometimes cheaper as a proportion of your income, and there are loads more ways to travel. And yet, what we see is also a similar trend, at least recently, in the amount of miles traveled. It's actually been diminishing a little bit by about 10% or so in the past 20 years. So the idea that people are voraciously consuming more and more travel doesn't bear true with the data, but it might be what you would experience if you were to be out in the world, as though the solution to transport problems is simply more and more transport moving faster and faster. And I think these charts are important because these are trends that people would struggle to perceive. You and I don't go out in the world and can perceive relatively small changes in national travel going up and down. But unlike many things we might talk about today, they are actually things that we can measure and that we can theorize, so we can propose good reasons and we can respond and design for. So that final name on the bottom right-hand corner of the slide, David Metz, has been an influence on Rory and I's work because of his persistent pursuit of the travel smart, not fast solution, which cascades into a lot of things, from land use planning, and the fact that if we simply speed journeys up, people won't necessarily save more time. They'll use that faster time to live further away from things and access more things, which is great, but that does rather change the nature of the case that you might be making for transport improvements. He also makes important points that we agree with about digital journey planning and the role that journey planning plays in changing the consciousness of how people travel. Next slide. And I jumped straight into what was, I suppose, an early behavioral science or behavior change theory, one familiar to a lot of people, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Curiously, he didn't draw a pyramid, but people after him did construct this as a pyramid. And he was at pains to saying, you don't just satisfy basic needs and ladder things up. But the overall argument remains true that transport does need to be ultimately a fundamentally there. It needs to be safe, it needs to work, it needs to consider very basic human needs. And it also needs to account for all these other characteristics of society, how the time is spent traveling, perhaps even much more profound experiences alongside. And that's part of the motivation for this piece of work. And I hope you might agree that if nothing else, people are spending 400 hours of their year traveling. We ought to treat them with dignity, with respect, and it would be great. Really, at minimum, their time should be spent in a meaningful way, whether that is listening to a radio, whether it's talking to a friend, whether it's simply feeling fine. These are really important ways in which people spend their time, not merely as a complete job to be done. As the next piece of theory, and I promise this isn't a lecture on behavior change theory, but I'd love to give one. Next slide talks about the way this hierarchy of needs is really evolving. So as much as this pyramid looks relatively static, the things that we provide as what seem to be basic needs shift into being more fundamental, more performance needs. So at once, Wi-Fi or mobile signal might have been a delight to those early adopters of mobile phones back in the 80s. It then became a more a more performance function that you might hope to have. Mobile signal, I'll contend now, precisely because transport is so integrated with the digital world for digital tickets, for booking, for journey planning. Mobile signal and Wi-Fi is really almost a basic need for a modern transport system to function. And this chart does a little bit more than simply showing change over time. It also is really helpful in thinking about the things that are worth improving. So what's it worth to a transport provider or to an employer or to a local government to improve things? It's not enough to simply provide basic needs, because you'll butt up against what people really want. They also want features that help their general performance. And if you want to encourage people to do something, it pays to understand what delights them and what drives their desire to do it. So more delight features have a role to play in a transport system.
The simplest one I encountered recently was I flew out of London City Airport on the Embraer 190, which is a very small plane, 2x2 seating. And it's the only plane which has a little thing on the back of the seat in front of you for you to hold your mobile phone so you can watch a film on the flight or do whatever you want. Now, that thing probably costs something like £50 per seat to add, but in accordance with Carnot theory, it's the thing I remember most about the entire flight because it was a delight factor. And on French trains, you have a little holder for your mobile phone that's near to the charger, for example. And those little details are fascinating for two reasons. In many cases, they cost almost nothing, yet perceptually, they do a lot of the heavy lifting.
Yeah, completely. And you can take experience from different modes. So while this sounds like a great aeroplane experience, the same sort of features are rolling out in buses across the country of phone holders and of USB ports. It could sometimes be described as something that's frivolous, but when you net in the fact that tickets are embedded in phones, that people depend on their phone to navigate, to be sure that they're traveling safely, to contact loved ones, the USB port is now really an important feature of being able to have.
Really important warning. These are the first things to get cut by the finance function when they're looking for cost savings. And so the standard sort of procurement approach is when we're short of money, we get rid of everything that delights, everything that's, if you like, discretionary. And because usually there isn't a metric for that. And it's terribly dangerous because you end up with something which is fundamentally too utilitarian.
And therein, we make the case that there's a broad spectrum of wants and needs, that transport is performing lots and lots of different functions. So on the next slide, I share, an important contemporary understanding of how we might think about people's travel. A wonderful new tool called the connectivity tool that's rolled out this year from the Department for Transport that maps out not just clearly the space between places, but how long it takes to get between places. A really smart way in which you can understand, some aspect of connectivity, as it describes, a tool to help built environment professionals understand how sustainably located a place and the transport interventions needed to support it. So I think this will be used widely, but, and you can probably see the rub, it's worth saying what it is and what it isn't. It is a map of journey time, but it is not a map of how accessible places are. So how much the bus costs to use, how frequently it runs, whether there are cycle lanes present, how easy the footways are to walk. So all of these other human factors have yet to be built in. So a brilliant tool to understand this relationship between time and space. But if we reduce transport journey experiences down to the time taken, we miss all of those hierarchy of needs and all those factors that we know govern people's decisions and other things that people say they want to be improved. So a lot of this comes down to using things wisely and later in the book, we talk about the importance of just having lots of metrics to understand what's going on. So lots of different measures. Next slide. So coming back to base, our overall thesis is, transport engineering and economics have governed transport for a long time. They're absolutely fundamental to making things go. If we didn't have engineers, we wouldn't have all these propulsion technologies that make things happen. Our case is that they're necessary, but no longer sufficient for a modern transport system. So this is a yes and sort of mindset. Transport for Humans case makes a case for a more balanced perspective of saying we've pursued engineering and economics approaches for a long time. We now need to add more skill sets and mindsets to the discipline. And next slide. And in that sense, social and these behavioral insights are really important. And they're really important because they're going to always fundamentally be the things that fall outside the equations of what we can measure as engineers or as economists. So the things that you could go out with a tape measure or with a spreadsheet and measure, the elements of human perspective and human experience. A philosopher will call them qualia. They're things like pain, perception of safety, frustration, anxiety, hope, enjoyment. It sounds very poetic, but they will persist for as long as we're alive and for everyone that comes after. But they're the things that elude the ability to put in a tape measure or put in a particular thing. So next slide, please. So part of their case is to say we're Homo sapiens and not Homo transporticus. And Homo transporticus is building on this wider area of saying, let's not reduce people down to the fiction that they know all the routes, that they know all the costs, that they understand where things go. In reality, we're much more fallible than that. Next slide. And I promised this wasn't going to be a behavior change lecture, but I couldn't resist showing this slide. And it's probably to really provide a commentary and cut across lots of elements, knowing that people come from different disciplines and embracing this sort of interdisciplinarity. Many will be familiar with behavior change theory as promoted by frameworks like COM-B from UCL, or longer psychological theories of planned behavior, and so on and so forth. This just, in a way, disrupts, but also makes it clear that there's just different ways of looking at a particular problem, and you want to choose the best fit for the right situation. So in the top left, these are like models of looking at what's happening in the individual's head. What are they capable? Do they have the chances and opportunities to do it? Are they motivated? But of course, that's never going to be enough. So we go over to the right-hand side and we look at slightly higher levels of society, how people are embedded in communities and in society. So fill your boots with that if that's the lens you want to take. In the bottom left-hand corner, of course, if you just take those perspectives, you miss the fact that things change over time and a person changes over time. So things like the theories of adoption curve show how adoption increases faster and faster at certain rates, and certain people are more likely to adopt choices. And then finally, in the bottom right-hand corner, you were to really cut to it and you were saying, well, I really want, if you could say you wanted to diagnose exactly what's going on, you could spend your life diagnosing the causes of things, but that wouldn't necessarily lead you to knowing the solutions and the problems to solve. So these applied models and frameworks, the likes of Behavioural Insights teams, EAST framework or Mindspace framework, and the government's different approaches, in a way cut to it with shortcuts for saying here are the ways in which you might simply design a system that works well for people. My view, Rory's view, is that we need to be more creative with the solutions that we have. So as much as it's important to understand all the causes of things, there are many right answers to different causes of things, and that sometimes new ideas of problem answers to solutions come out of left field that don't necessarily relate to why somebody's doing something in the particular moment. So this is really a call for taking a look at things from different angles and and being creative with the solutions that we provide. Next slide. I'll now jump through 3 or 4 important points and hand over to Rory. So going through, here's a worked example of how we might apply transport for humans perspective, ways of improving reliability. The engineer or the economist might say, well, make it more reliable. Let's measure how reliable something is. How often does this thing show up? What's its percentage punctuality? We can keep working at making things reliable. For sure, we should do that. And there are critical levels of unreliability that make something not very usable. But secondly, we should also, I think, understand psychologically what aspects of reliability are people's problems. Is it showing up a few minutes late? Is it showing up 10 minutes late? Or is it the fear of dependability that it simply won't come along at all? So what level of punctuality are people building their lives around? We should account for that. Some systems clearly have a bit more leeway than others. If you're on a very long train or drive or plane, then being 10 minutes late is clearly decisively different to something that interchanges and is a short trip. Then next, we might also be sensitive to the fact that people have misperceptions about reliability. If they think it's more reliable than it really is, then they might have expectations that are persistently not met, and they're persistently disappointed. That would be a shame. But equally, if someone thinks it's much less reliable than it really is, which I think is true of a lot of UK local buses, which do great, but people think they're unreliable from bad past experiences, let's also work to correct those misperceptions. It would be a tragedy to make something much more reliable, but people didn't know about it, and they stayed clear from it. And then this worked example, finally, and I think this is, for me, the most exciting area. We will always have a bit of an unreliable system. Things won't have perfect punctuality. Even the Shinkansen bullet train in Japan doesn't have perfect reliability and punctuality, right? So let's design solutions and design systems that help people navigate an inherently a little bit unreliable system. And one solution to that has been live passenger information, which does a few of those things, but notably helps people acknowledge things won't arrive exactly on the timetable, but if we let you know when they are going to arrive, you'll be able to use that waiting time, which is otherwise very painful and anxious, in a more profitable and more meaningful sort of way. Likewise, notifications in the hours or days before, notifications to the people you are going to see about your sharing your journey and how it's going. It's also a way in which people can meaningfully work with reliability without having to manually update people along the way. Let's go to another example. Okay, so here's another sort of worked example of improving end-to-end journeys, and is emphatically an endorsement of transport integration. So I think the idea of an end-to-end journey came up, I think, within DFT about 20 or 30 years ago, as a way of really, in this just a couple of words, describing the fact that it's not just a particular mode, it's not just the bus trip or even the car trip. It's how what happens sort of from door to door. And transport integration is all about making it easier for people to connect up different modes of travel, closing the gap that's caused inequity between what people are able to do, what their skills are, and what their circumstances are. So in many ways, this is about making fares much easier to understand, in making routes more linked up, so local routes actually intersect and they smooth the journey across, and then more holistic planning, so the schedules all match up together. Third one, next slide. Something I shared at the previous zero carbon commuting conference, but I thought would be good today too. Psychological ways of approaching a commuting problem. This isn't by no means the whole problem, but one psychological diagnosis is there's currently an asymmetry of information. So when you are picking your job applicants unfortunately have the least information about their potential commutes at precisely the time they need it most. So they might be picking between different job application offers, or they might be thinking about things. But this is when they don't know very much about what the company's like, the hours of working, where they work. Of course, once you come to pick a job, you then learn a whole lot about the different options you might have. So really, job choices are unfortunately made with little information, just on perceived connectivity. And then when they come to commute, you might have based that on some assumptions. So really, this is trying to say, let's bring all this information, workplace travel planning, coaching information, way further up the up the chain. So policy ideas that would cascade from this would be employers publishing workplace travel plans on job adverts, so the connectivity of the place of the work that you're going to do, so people can have better insight. On employers reporting how currently people actually travel to their site in a way that people can then learn from others of what people doing those sort of jobs are actually doing, rather than having to read off a map. And even more socially, and some companies do this, a sort of induction buddy. So new starters connect with existing employees sort of in their area to share knowledge. Other people have looked at this the way people who walk and cycle share knowledge about routes and nice ways to travel. And of course, that kind of gossip, in a way, is a really important social fabric that helps people share insights. I'm optimistic that these would be helpful psychological solutions alongside all of the types of transport integration we put up there. Next slide. A broader point that is embedded in the Transport for Humans book, but actually I think is picked up a lot less than the points about people are not cargo. Maybe it's because it's buried a bit further in the concluding section. But I think this is where Rory and I are really united, that a nice way to think about improvements to travel and how people work is to work towards a more balanced diet of travel behavior. So if you'll indulge the metaphor, let's think of travel modes as different food groups. You want a mix of those things, and it would be a shame to really dine out on only one particular food group. And some things are healthy in others, some things are good in moderation. But what we need is to build towards more balanced diets, but also acknowledge the fact that, as I mentioned at the beginning, people are not merely drivers or bus users or cyclists. They are not monomodal, they're very multimodal. The National Travel Survey finds 83% of people who identify as cyclists also have access to a car. Would you believe people with access to a car actually cover more rail mileage than people without access to a car? So
wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
okay.
There you go.
Yeah.
So there, some people have small diets of travel, so they're not great consumers. They don't travel very much. And this is where we actually part company with the metaphor. Unlike food, which some people might live off 1,000 calories, some people, perhaps myself, if I do a lot of endurance training, might live off 4,000 calories in a day or 5,000. It only really varies by 1, 2, 3, 4 times. The amount that somebody can consume travel could vary almost by orders of magnitude if you fly a lot, if you drive a lot. So the inequity or difference in our diets of travel is really stark. And it's worth noting that the way in which we might move towards more balanced diets need to engage with the fact that some people consume a lot more than others. Just 2 more points from me. So next slide. One of the tensions that we've noted in behavioural change, in behavioural insights, is that, are you coming at this from theory as though you know more about people who travel than the people who travel, in which case you're continuing to come from the top down, like an economist that might understand a system, or are you engaging with people's needs and coming from the bottom up? As you can see, I think that there's a role for both of those things. People within the transport system, it behoves them to think innovatively, to come up with ideas that the general traveller is not going to come up with. I think two examples are the Hopper fare is a very nice example in London of uniting fares in a nice way. You pay one fee, and within a journey of an hour, you can go between buses. Likewise, on the right-hand side, putting the information on the side of a bus of its number, its origin, its destination, how often it comes, and crucially, the places it stops along the way, are ideas that I think transport operators and planners ought to use some insight and create ideas from the top down and give them to people, because I think it's less likely people are going to surface those sort of ideas themselves. They might do, but that kind of thinking creatively about alternative uses for what was advertising space, in this case in Brighton, and saying we're better off providing that information to people to increase ridership, seems like a smart management decision.
I'm basically a huge bus fan, but I'm unable to use buses because in London, for some bizarre reason, they've decided that the only information to display on the outside of a bus is the route number and the final destination. Now, the final destination is usually a depot somewhere on the outskirts of London, whose location I'm still not quite sure about. Clapton Ponds, for example, or Honor Oak Park. I know roughly where they are. What I need to know is, does it go past Victoria, Charing Cross, Cannon Street, Blackfriars, Farringdon, from any one of those stations from which I can actually get a train home? I would get on any bus knowing it stopped at any one of those 7 places, but the information isn't available to me. And by the time I've done the research, it's too late to catch the bus. So there seems to be an extraordinary informational deficit on the outside of London buses. And someone tried to put route information on the outside of buses, and they said you'd have to do a cost-benefit analysis in terms of the loss of advertising revenue. Now, my only point is there are quite a lot of bits of surface area of a bus which aren't devoted to advertising. I would have thought you could put the route information there, but apparently not. Who knows?
Yeah.
I mean, a QR code might help. I don't know, but I'm actually the bus, when I'm not time pressured, is my favoured form of transport in London, and I'm rendered almost incapable of using it, just from an informational deficit.
Exactly, and the great convenience of a bus is that it comes often, and you might see one coming and hop on it. But the real anxiety, a little bit like the pain of a wait, is to see something come towards you, think that you might want it, but be in a state of confusion about whether it's right or not. I think we've all had some experience of that. So these sort of ideas are really neat. They obviously do actually require some operational considerations, and we're sensitive to that. So the way in which you then manage the fleet, you've printed a number 7 on the side of the bus. I mean, in my mind, it could be done with a digital display and it could rotate around, but let's say you printed it, then a bus operator does need to commit that particular vehicle in its fleet to those operations. All these things are to say they have been done. Operators have found it successful, and what's even better is ideas that are tested and trialed can spread around the country. We can share best knowledge. There's things that even within the petri dish of the United Kingdom, that some places are innovating different ideas and that work in their place and that are worth trialing. In the wider world, there are amazing ideas that are done across different countries as well. So the second idea I wanted to, or this second sort of perspective, is bottom up. So it goes by different names of co-design, of public engagement, participatory approaches, sometimes in policies of a more deliberative fact. The idea that even if you know all the theory, you think you've got the world's greatest psychologists in your team and at hand, they will still say it's important to speak to people and for ideas to emerge bottom up. 2 nice examples of these are the engagement on the Merseyrail new rolling stock, where they get people from across the community to picking everything from the colours of the trains to the interiors to the shared space areas to the display of CCTV information on the carousels. Things that a transport professional might well miss are really ways in which you can bring these to the fore. And then ideas on the bottom left-hand corner where you engage people in their rollout. So bike hangers in many communities that engage with the fact that you can't have a bike hanger in absolutely every corner, but you can get people to sort of pitch and put a vote in for whether their street has one or not. So engaging at this more community level about where things happen. So again, you can see my view is a balanced one. We need both top-down idea creation from smart psychological insights and bottom-up, bringing people's minds and experiences together to surface ideas we might not otherwise come up with. And now finally, this next slide, this might help demystify what we've been talking about on behavioral insight, on behavior change, psychology. There are at least 4 ways to, in quotes, think people or think human. One that has sat outside of it, but is something we rely on a great deal, has been data and operational performance. So how are my services performing? What are some operational metrics? How many trips are happening? Are the buses moving where we expect them to be? Are we delivering X, Y, and Z on a particular contract? That's fine. And obviously, you need those of operational performance. But these 4 ways are really important. First, of social research to understand what are people thinking, feeling, and doing. So the kind of statistics on where people are actually traveling to and from, how often they're using a service, clearly how they feel when they're doing so. And a lot more work to be done with technology to really understand where journeys are starting and ending, how people trip, chain, and mix transport within their day, things that are currently reduced. But it's a bit of a shame that some of our best data comes from a census that's done once every 10 years that asks what's your primary way of commuting. And then we base a lot of transport modeling off a question that's asked. Unfortunately, during the COVID pandemic, but it's beset with other challenges as well of leaving out data that we otherwise might need. Then you might do those more traditional, but clearly very innovative, long-standing methods of social research. Behavioral insights comes at it from that more psychological theory and evidence and a cross-cutting perspective of what might influence people, how might we understand why they're doing what they're doing. It goes by different names, and the asterisk describes behavioral science being the science aspect of building knowledge across theory and experimentation, of insight being more driven by what we can see working, and behavior change being that broader theory of behavior change. And then these 2 points might otherwise fall out of some of our work of public engagement, of how people are visibly heard in consultations, in democratic process, deliberative work, and then evaluation of how we even know what works, and evaluation teams. So this is in praise of saying behavioral science, a great piece of behavioral science and behavior change needs to engage with at least all of these 4 ways to think people. And sorry if that gets a bit technical, or in a way it's a bit it can be a bit dry, but in writing the book, I think Rory and I netted out that the very minimum what good looks like is bringing more people into the transport, mobility, land use, urban planning profession, and more people from those disciplines with job creation, with working in balanced teams. And it kind of stems from there that the sector needs to look inwards to itself about who it's hiring, the diversity of those people, and how we might give a voice to these disciplines that traditionally transport has left out. So I'll park that briefly and pass over.
Have you one tiny favour? Have you got the paceometer on the deck?
Oh yes.
I have to show the pace. I
imagine Jack can cue that up at will, but pull that trigger when you need to.
Yes, if you could put the paceometer up. Don't worry, you've got a few minutes to do so. Here we go. This is an absolute epiphany. I showed it to Nassim Taleb, the author of The Black Swan and Fooled by Randomness, and he said it's absolutely fascinating because it's mathematically trivial but completely non-intuitive. And the paceometer was invented by Peer, A.L. Peer, I think it is, and Solomon, and two behavioral scientists. And it's simply a way of showing speed backwards. Now, by convention, we always describe speed as miles per hour, distance in a particular time, meters per second, whatever it may be. And the fascinating thing about that is that there is an inherent perceptual bias in the display of that information. Because if you display on the inside of the paceometer on the right, what you'll see is a speedometer. It's miles per hour. We're all familiar with that. On the outside is the paceometer. And that shows the same thing, but backwards. Some of you may know that there's a debate in the display of car fuel economy, which is we use miles per gallon in the Anglo-American world. The rest of the world uses litres per 100 kilometres. They do it the other way around. And that gives you a very different perspective on what really saves you, what is an economical vehicle. It may seem absolutely irrelevant moving from a car that does 12 miles to the gallon to 16, whereas in fact it's making an inordinate difference to your fuel consumption. A car that goes 67 miles to the gallon versus 60, however, is much less impressive than it sounds. And consequently, the paceometer simply reverses this display. And what you very rapidly see is that it's anything but linear. So if you can accelerate from 10 miles an hour to 20 miles an hour over the course of a 10-mile journey, you'll save 30 minutes. If you accelerate from 20 to 30, you save 10 minutes. If, however, you're already going at 70 miles an hour and you accelerate to 80, you will feel you're saving an enormous amount of time because 80 feels really fast and you're overtaking lots of cars. In terms of time saving, it's pretty nugatory. So this is, in many ways, what I'm saying is, even if the two things are objectively exactly the same, 60 miles an hour is exactly the same as 10 minutes to go 10 miles. To a physicist, they're exactly the same. The way you display the information completely changes how people respond. And that strikes me as one really, really interesting finding. This is important in road safety. I show this in every presentation, and my argument is it's a good illustration of my point, but more to the point, there's 600 people listening in today. That could save somebody's life, or at least save them from a serious accident. Because the faster you're going already, the less time you save by going 10 miles an hour faster still. Meanwhile, your fuel consumption is going up exponentially. Your risk of accident is going up exponentially. Your risk of serious injury is going up exponentially. All these other factors are getting worse and worse. The amount of time you're saving is basically flatlining. Now, that explains why, in order to save a trivial 3.5 hours on a transatlantic flight, you need a plane that goes 4 times as fast as a standard airliner. You could argue that the Concorde was kind of doomed by the paceometer. It would also explain, I think, why it wasn't necessary for high speed 2 to go that fast. Given the distance between London and Manchester, even allowing for onward journeys, the amount of time you save by going, let's say, 220 miles an hour rather than 140 or 150 is basically irrelevant. And the price of that added speed is not only danger, it means the tracks have to be built in a completely straight line, and it's impossible to have intermediate stations where the train stops because the deceleration and acceleration time is so extreme. Now, the other thing that I drove from looking at this, which only occurred to me a week ago, is this shows why the bicycle was an incredibly important invention. Because in terms of miles per hour, the bicycle, let's say 12, Pete's obviously a triathlete, so he'll be slightly more impressive. But the bicycle isn't massively faster than walking in terms of numbers of miles per hour it can do. In terms of the time you save on a 5 mile, 10-mile journey, it's a complete game changer. And so the rover safety bicycle was probably much, much more economically important than anybody actually realized at the time. That's one really important point, which is that how you display information will entirely affect how we respond to it and what the information means. A few other things. Problem definition. One of my big rants is that nearly all problems are defined effectively by engineers, and that immediately turns the thing into an engineering problem. Now, my argument was very simple. I've gone slightly viral on this. Range anxiety is a problem for electric car adoption. By the way, it's slightly foolish because almost everybody who buys an electric car, particularly if they can charge at home, but even if they can't, largely finds range anxiety irrelevant. Yeah, we can cut away from the slides. Range anxiety is composed of two things, range and anxiety. And there are two ways you can reduce range anxiety. You can increase range or you can reduce anxiety. Now, quite rightly, lots of physicists and other people obsessed with energy density are spending billions and billions of dollars trying to increase range. I would argue that's not a worthless activity. It's both and, as Pete said. But if we're prepared to spend that amount of money increasing range, wouldn't it be quite valuable to spend perhaps 1% of the budget reducing anxiety? And my argument is that the solution of range anxiety through ever greater range, where your car is optimized not for the typical journey you make, but for a journey you may make 3 times a year. I've got a friend who's obsessed with the range of her new car simply because she goes to Newcastle 3 times a year. My argument is that we're going to end up with a lot of cars which are more expensive than they need to be. They're heavier than they need to be. They're sitting outside houses in many cases using up lithium, which is completely unnecessary 97% of the time. Perhaps what we should have been doing is reducing anxiety. Now, there are lots of ways you can do this. I've argued repeatedly that it's completely foolish for the battery indicator on an electric car. Mine currently says 74%. I don't need individual digits. Just say 70% plus. Okay. I will need individual digits in the unlikely event that I get down to 7% or 14%. I don't need to see that I've lost 2% of my battery capacity by going to the shops. All it's going to do is make me anxious. It's information I don't need to know. My petrol gauge didn't have that level of granularity. So one of the crucial things is there are hundreds of ways. I've talked to Greg Jackson at Octopus about this. He, I think, rightly believes that there'll be a big decrease in range anxiety once it's understood that every gas station has an electric charging facility. He just thinks it's a psychological tipping point. It's not really relevant or even optimal in terms of the location of the charging facilities. But the great advantage of gas stations is they're very, very visible. There are already more rapid car chargers in the UK than there are petrol stations. The UK is a particularly interesting case because in the UK, Belgium, the Netherlands, range anxiety is almost entirely irrelevant. It's not irrelevant in the United States, where you might have to travel 400 miles through wilderness. In the UK, which is extremely densely populated outside a few parts of Wales and northern Scotland, range anxiety is a complete irrelevance because we only need chargers to serve a population, not to serve a geography. We have 8,500 gas stations in the UK. The United States needs 116,000. Now it's only got about, 5 times the population, maybe 5.5, but it actually needs 20 times the gas stations because a lot of their gas stations serve a location, not a population. And consequently, we will never need as many chargers as the United States will per head of population. And the whole question of range anxiety is silly in a dense country because you go, ooh, that charging station is occupied. Ooh, look, there's one over there. It's not the same if you're driving from Boise, Idaho to Bozeman, Montana. I get that. But this is an American fear we've kind of imported, and it's psychological. And my argument is that range anxiety is largely being solved the wrong way round. We should make people content to have cars. My wife has a Mini, one of the early electric Minis, which only has a range of about 100 miles. This has never inconvenienced us in the slightest. Okay. So that's a really important point. Second point, let's look at a psychological case study where we created massive amounts of value simply through psychology. Well, not exclusively. That's the London Overground. And I always talk about this because the London Overground carries as many people as the Elizabeth line. The Elizabeth line cost £20 billion. The Overground rebranding and improvement, and some of it was engineering focused, some of it was lighting, frequency of service, rolling stock, etc. But it only cost 200 million. The main achievement was basically perceptual. They pretended it was a tube line. This wasn't the intention necessarily. It was the rebranding was partly because it was taken over by TfL from, I think, Silverlink Metro. But the simple fact was that Londoners see a British rail sign or a national rail sign, and they think that is irrelevant to me because other than South East Londoners, they use the tube to navigate London, and they use the tube map as a proxy for London. I'm so sorry. By pretending the Overground was a tube line, which of course it wasn't, okay, suddenly the mental availability and saliency of those modes of transport became immediately obvious when they were previously invisible. It was simply, most of that success, most of that, what I would call 20 billion worth of new infrastructure was created through pixels and ink, not through rails and rolling stock. And a final point, which is really important, Peter earlier on mentioned there's the adoption curve of new technology. And this is something that really worries me because it occurred to me that most people in most economic models assume that people are rational optimizers. And therefore, if a better way of doing something comes up, they'll immediately adopt it. Sometimes that's true, but it's only true for relatively trivial forms of investment. Let me explain. I'm quite a regular user, even though I live in Sevenoaks, of High Speed 1. If I need to get to North London, I drive up to Ebbsfleet and I take the train in. What was fascinating to me was it took High Speed 1 is now regularly rammed. It's very, very successful. For the first 5 or 6 years, I would occasionally have a carriage to myself. Now, here's the question which comes back to that David Metz question. If you focus on time saving as a metric, the best way to actually spend your money is to get people doing things they were doing already, but a bit faster. When I was a kid, they dual carriagewayed the A40 between Raglan and Abergavenny, connecting the heads of the Valley Road with the A449, which was already a dual carriageway. On the day that road opened, everybody switched from the old 2-lane road to the new dual carriageway. Incredibly quick adoption. The downside of that was that nearly everybody was doing something they were already going to do. They were just doing it a bit faster. By contrast, High Speed 1 works much more slowly by effectively creating completely new possibilities for people to work and live in different places, for people to shop in different places, to people traveling differently. Behavioral change is slow. So if you take an existing behavior and you make it faster, it looks like you're a great success because the thing takes off immediately. If you create significant behavioral change by enabling people to do something altogether different, for the first few years, it looks as if you're a failure because the behavioral change required is greater and therefore the pace of adoption is correspondingly slower. It's called the Bass diffusion curve. And there's a problem here, I think, because we will all, the other problem, by the way, is that if you look at time saving as the metric, you will almost certainly end up over investing in London, which is already quite well supplied with transport, and under investing in the north. So the time saving metric will completely distort where you save your money, partly because, of course, people in the south are slightly more economically important. So their time saved is therefore deemed to be more valuable. So you end up with a ludicrous kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. But that model strikes me as terrible. One of the things I always thought, working in marketing, I always thought if you have a really big idea, you don't need much marketing, because it's such a big idea, people will adopt it immediately, and you only need marketing when it's a relatively trivial distinction. I then learned much too late, in many ways it's the other way around, that really, really big ideas require people to change their behavior, to adopt entirely new behaviors. And because the two default modes of human behavior are habit and social copying, In other words, do what I've done before, do what everybody else is doing. The adoption of a new behavior is just mentally painful. The final point I'll make, because I've just hit the hour, is that what you don't measure can kill you. If you look at the Challenger disaster, it's often displayed in NASA, the sign, "In God we trust, everybody else brings data." Now, data is hugely valuable, but it very quickly transmogrifies into an invisible rule that if you haven't got any data, you're not allowed to say anything. In other words, everything that isn't accompanied by data is discounted. The reason the Challenger disaster happened is the engineers knew that the O-rings were brittle at low temperatures. And the engineers didn't want the thing to take off. However, they hadn't got any specific data on the performance of O-rings below 54 degrees Fahrenheit. And so consequently, they were effectively silenced from the debate by the absence of data. So things to which data is not attached can still be really important. And so things that really fascinate me are, one of the things we must do is just accept observation. Something that fascinates me, okay, is the Heathrow pod. And the reason the Heathrow pod fascinates me is that I don't think it scores that brilliantly compared to perhaps a tram or a bus shuttle between a car park and an airport. There is one utterly fascinating thing about the Heathrow pod, which is although the Heathrow pod car park is about a mile away from Heathrow Terminal 5, the price of parking there is almost adjacent to the price of parking in the short stay car park. Now, that data simply says that regardless of any data you may have on, its capacity or its speed or its journey time, there's something about a pod which is enormously more popular with the traveller than the corresponding bus shuttle, because car parks a similar distance away connected by bus are probably half the price of the pod parking. Now, I don't know why that is. We can find out. There are all kinds of interesting reasons why it might be. What you have potentially there is an insight that says we could build on most of the railway station car parks that are in central town locations. We could use land value capture to raise tens of millions of pounds, and we could use a pod running alongside the tracks to create one or more parkway stations on the outskirts of town, meaning that commuters no longer needed to drive right into the middle of town simply to travel all the way out again by train. Now, all I'm saying is that's a behavioural insight. Now, what I think happens with transport innovation is procurement and people like the Treasury want sameness for purposes of ease of comparison. And so the metrics that you're using to decide what's good tend to be the metrics established by whatever the dominant mode of transport is already. This also happens in business, if you like, where the dominant player tends to determine the metrics that are used for comparison, and the metrics get set to the advantage of the dominant player. Generally, when you look at an innovation of any kind that appeals to people psychologically, it's much worse on one or two dimensions, but which are already measured, but it's much better on other dimensions which aren't measured. So to give you an example, the original iPhone had an appalling battery life. If you had a procurement function or the Treasury buying mobile phone handsets, they wouldn't have bought the iPhone. And the reason they wouldn't have bought the iPhone is they would have said, no, you have to have a Nokia or BlackBerry because it needs to last for 36 hours. What happened is people loved the experience of the iPhone to such an extent, they were prepared to find workarounds for the battery life. They took a charger into work. They bought a bulbous case that fitted on the back. And I think what we have to be really, really careful of is that the metrics of comparison, which is I want to justify a decision, act in direct opposition to the metrics of innovation. The innovations generally don't work by being better at a metric that people already care about. They actually work by discovering a metric that's been completely undiscovered before. And I'll end with that, which is the Uber map is what's really important about Uber. There is not much difference between riding in an Uber and riding in any other taxi in terms of the journey itself. What they suddenly did is they made brilliant the experience of waiting for a cab by removing the level of uncertainty about what the car would look like, what its registration number was, and when it would actually arrive. And so the way to innovate in transport is not to benchmark, it's to do what I call reverse benchmarking. What's nobody else measuring? Let's go and focus on that and hit it out of the park is a much more successful way to innovate than let's take what everybody's doing already and tweak it by 5 or 10%. So fundamentally, we have to realize that metrics are highly conservative because you tend to compare what could be with what already is, and the incomparably good therefore gets frozen out at the first stage of bidding. And we have to be really, really alert to this. Finally, let's not get so anti-car. One of the things that alarms me is that so much transport policy is formed in London, which is a completely unrepresentative environment in which to understand transportation. And I would argue that road building is probably fundamental to house building. And that one of the most interesting things we could do is effectively build roads in places where no one has thought of building roads, and then effectively fund them by land value capture by house building along the way. I have absolutely no idea why land value capture is not. I'm a Georgist, by the way, just to complicate things. But you could have paid for high speed 2 entirely by buying 10,000 acres of agricultural land in 3 places, 2 between London and Birmingham, 1 between Birmingham and Manchester. Award yourself planning permission, put a station in the middle of that land on high speed 2. You've now got 10,000 acres, which is within 20 minutes of Euston Station. 10 minutes of Euston Station if you're lucky. That's practically St John's Wood. Okay, now you've got your £100 billion and you've got a free railway for everybody else to use. This is the only case I've come across where I've written repeatedly to say, hey government, would you like £100 billion for free? And nobody's interested. I have no idea why this is. It's probably something to do with a silo effect, or probably lawyers. But the total failure to exploit land value capture to pay for infrastructure is one of the great disasters of our time. Funnily enough, the early underground railways were actually funded by people whose property prices would go up if a tube line were actually installed to their district. It's something the Victorians knew all about. We seem to have lost it. I have no idea why. Hope that's useful.
Yeah, really, really helpful. Brilliant. Fantastic. Thank you to you both. I think we've got about 20 minutes left, which I think is spot on for a vast array of questions that are coming through. And actually, I think, we'll crack straight into some of them if you don't mind.
Of course.
Goodness. I've been busy trying to, if one's come to your eye and you want to answer them, but I've been trying to categorize them a little bit as well myself. I really like what you talked about there in terms of behavior change being functions of habit and social copying. And I to both of you, I guess you also reference the fact that it takes time.
Yeah.
I mean, how much more needs to be spent on behavior change to really kind of get things going? And I also like, we talk a lot about transport as a service, but I really like what you talk about as within the book about travel as a skill. And I think so there's a combination of spend on behavior change, but also how do we better teach the skill of travel?
A very simple marketing lesson, by the way, is that there are a lot of behaviors. Ocado, find that once you've made 4 Ocado orders, Ocado is now part of your repertoire. But you've got to get people over that initial hump. When they launched High Speed 1, why didn't they go to Rochester and say, here's your free return trip for you and your family? So, that's elementary sales promotion from a marketing point of view. And yet, weirdly, you could have accelerated, I think, the pace of adoption really significantly if you just use promotional mechanics to get people to make the journey once. In Denmark, you get free rail travel on your birthday. And part of the point of that is they think, well, if everybody makes at least one rail journey a year, they're no longer a rail virgin. And therefore, they will then, when it comes to choosing between a rail journey and a car journey, they're now making an informed decision based on experience rather than a decision based on prejudice and habit. So simple. Pete and I both completely agree on this mixed diet thing. I'm a bit of Pete's a fanatical cyclist, and I'm an electric car nut. Just to be clear, that's that business of mixing people up, of behavioural encouragement, of diversity of use, which is often achieved seriously in the commercial world just by sales promotion or by brand partnerships or something of that kind. It can be done very, very inexpensively, and it generally pays. That needs to be adopted much, much more. And one of the exciting things about the Great British Railway thing is by having a central unitary rail authority, we're going to be able to have a loyalty program. We're going to be able to have, if there's anybody on this call over 55, they'll remember the Persil British Rail promotion of the 1970s to sell family rail cards, which was a spectacular success and bizarrely never repeated.
Pete, anything from you in terms of how much more should be allocated within major infrastructure projects, transport activities for behaviour change? I mean, should it be an explicit line in projects?
Well, I think that's an interesting one, because when you do so, and I'm on the behaviour change policy panel for Transport Planning Society, for instance, I'm aware that there is a separate money allocated to behaviour change, but it does rather deprive the discipline from its holistic look. So it's as though that the behaviour change things are the things that happen on the side. They're the communications bit of all the soft stuff. I mean, if I've impressed anything, it's that behaviour change is this holistic look. It is a look at capability, opportunity, motivation, the social landscape. So I'm not necessarily saying the behaviour change person should be the chief executive and should guide everything, but it should be that there is a fluency and understanding of the discipline that cascades throughout the organisation. The metaphor I can give is that imagine behaviour change and social insight is like statistics and data. We spend hours and hours teaching young children, primary school, secondary school, numbers, arithmetic, statistics, so that when you're in the workplace, we all know everyone really needs to have a minimum amount of maths knowledge. I think a useful metaphor is that we all do need to have, within a transport sector, a minimum amount of behaviour change and human understanding knowledge. And that then there are some people who are the data whizzes, the people who are the equivalent of the expert statisticians. They're tasked with particular jobs, but we get a better baseline level of capability. And that people don't arrive within their transport jobs with an entirely lay understanding of what they think, of how they think people behave. In the same way that it's not okay to arrive at your job with an idea of a personal conception about how maths or statistics works.
And so similarly, its problem definition is part of it. My argument was that if High Speed 2, the brief had been given to Disney, they would have asked the question, how do you make a train journey between London and Manchester so enjoyable people feel stupid going by car? Which is a better question than how do you get X people to Y in Z minutes?
I think there was a question. I think there was a question in there about, what else can we be doing in terms of delighters? Teas and coffees on buses. What else can we be doing to kind of make it more interesting, more exciting?
The weirdest thing of all is that Thameslink trains, which cost, I don't know, 20 or 30 million each, came without seat back tables. And that might be a journey from Brighton to London. Now, one of the things about time is we don't get really excited about how fast our washing machine is because we don't watch our washing while it's being washed. Okay, if you do, you really need to upgrade your Sky package a bit, right? Okay, right. So we put the washing on and we get on with something else. Now, time where you can be getting on with something else, which is the USP of the train, if you have a table, the fact that you can be accomplishing something else while you're actually on a train is the USP of the train for many people, not for everybody. Some people don't have a car, etc., etc. I'd also argue first class rail travel. I'm a big fan. Let me explain why. I know there's an egalitarian tendency to make everything single class, which the wretched Southeastern have done, which means that I don't pay £5 a day extra to get a table anymore because I can't. Okay, well done, Southeast trains. My argument is that first class rail is better than a car. Second class rail probably isn't for a lot of journeys. So if you want to get people who own nice cars out of their car and onto a train, you've got to have a correspondingly nice train journey. And so that understanding that people are traveling by train for all kinds of different reasons, they've chosen that mode of transport for 5 different reasons. There may also be 5 different reasons why people aren't traveling by train. I was on the Sevenoaks Rail Travellers group, and they had their Zoom call, and they were introducing new trains that are the slow trains into Charing Cross. And 3 of the people on the thing said, "Are there toilets on the train?" "No, I can't use them then." Simple
Yeah.
as that. You know, the
Okay.
prostate gland may be the biggest obstacle to rail travel, and yet you look at the provision of toilets at London Bridge Station; it's abominable. There is no way of using a non-disabled toilet if you're changing platform at London Bridge, and yet they've spent £500 million on that thing. Okay, and yet one of the big obstacles for more elderly rail users has completely been unsolved.
Mm. I like what you said. I mean, it's an interesting piece around how to encourage sustainable travel, thinking about status and identity. And
Yeah.
actually, there's cohorts of the population where they need further encouragement. They need it to be better.
Yes.
There's something you also mentioned about the sales pitch. Question around a book, actually. Someone's recently read Obvious Adams, The Tale of a Businessman Who Achieved Success by Stating the
Beautiful.
Obvious. So, what obvious insight do businesses, and obviously we're thinking about businesses and commuting, what are they missing or overlooking when it comes to travel? Is there anything you can really articulate there that you're thinking in terms of that? And while you're thinking about that, I'm just going to pose another lot of questions because we've got loads. A topic about safety, well, ultimately bad actors. I used to call them in a previous life bad actors, those
Mm.
who do damage to public transport, who make services poorer. The safety aspect, the vandalism aspect. What needs to happen there in terms of behavioural change to give people confidence? So, a couple of ones throwing them at you,
I can have a go at an obvious one for commuters
please.
and businesses. Yeah, generated from a session I did in Sheffield with Nota Bene last month. There was a point made that for commuters out of Sheffield, the bus service provision to employer sites on the outskirts of the city was poor, and it's known that it's both not as frequent, but it's also unreliable. So people don't take the bus because if they miss the bus, then they're faced with some disciplinary action. A nice obvious insight there is the fact that we shunt all of the risk and responsibility onto the traveller, when really it's the trip generators like the employers who have some responsibility and the biggest stake in really getting their workforce. And obviously businesses will lobby and try and get better public transport access. But why don't we flip that around, that rather than it become a possible excuse that an employee is saying, "Oh, I'm late because the bus didn't show up," and they say, "Yeah, right, we've heard that one before." We don't enable employers and public transport and work together to like validate a journey and say, QR code bash, I'm at the bus stop, I'm waiting for the bus, and you can see the bus hasn't arrived, and they accept that that's part of the problem, rather than put it all on the employee, require them to give their reasons, their excuses, the plausibility, all of that. All the while, years have gone by and people have said, "So that I have to get a car and I'm just going to have to drive to this place of work when I don't
I think that's
able to
excellent.
secure
I
my
really
job." So I hope that's kind of obvious what that jumps out.
Yeah, I really like that. I think technology's here that can actually, like you say, timestamp how people have traveled and give that evidence. And it shouldn't be then, a battle. It should be recognition that actually, fantastic, it is not your fault. In terms of safety and vandalism and all those, I mean, safety is really interesting and real-time information. Even myself, I'm a regular bus user, live in Leeds. I got the bus home the other day. It was about 9 o'clock. Terrible weather. Couldn't see outside the bus. Now it's a route I always take, so I kind of should know where I am. But actually,
No,
slightly befuddled by the fact of where I was because the weather was so bad you couldn't see outside the windows. And guess what? The real-time information in the bus didn't work.
no,
So I actually spent a trip that I take a lot of the time feeling quite anxious,
anxious. Yeah.
really anxious. Have I missed my stop? I'm sure I'm here. Oh, actually, I'm not. So, yeah, if you're not used to travel, and again, thinking about travel as a skill, that's really difficult. So, yeah, safety, traveling at night, vandalism, thoughts around all of that in terms of behavior change.
There was one question about intergenerational inequality, and I have to say there are two things. I've just got my senior rail card, and it seems to me fundamentally a bit unjust because I'm still in work. Okay? I can quite often travel to work off peak, which I will do today, interestingly, on my senior rail card. And it does seem to me a bit dubious in some cases that some of those concessions may be overly generous. Given intergenerational inequality and the fact that, in many cases, not all cases, in many cases it's totally worthwhile, but in many cases you're giving someone who's paid off their mortgage, whose children have left home, who's earning more than they've ever earned in their life, a concessionary rail journey. The only good thing is you can get concessionary first class off-peak fares, which is probably quite a good way of filling first class compartments and getting the person to pay a bit more. Um, the other thing that bothers me is the whole question of delay repay, which I think is massively subject to fraud. I hear anecdotally of people who basically buy this kind of semi-open return, then go on the website to discover which train was delayed and then claim they were trying to travel on that train. It's also, in many cases, ludicrously overgenerous. In that, I had a train. I had a train journey, first class advanced fare from Newcastle to London. The train was cancelled. They rebooked me on a train an hour later. I had a coffee at the station and got on with some work. They got me a seat on the second train. I was barely inconvenienced at all, and yet I got the entire journey for free. I would have preferred that money to have gone to funding delighters on the rail network, to be honest.
Interesting. Yeah, no, interesting. Um, right, we've got a bunch of other stuff. Think about future mobility, I would say, autonomous,
Mm.
views on fractional vehicle ownership. I mean, before we started, Roy, we talked about the fact that, people don't need two cars, they need one. If they want to go from one to two cars or need to, it's not that they need
Yeah.
to, they need 1.2. So in terms of, again, thinking about future transport, your views on autonomous mobility, what's that going to do? Waymo coming to London, that type of thing, and fractional vehicle ownership, particularly for personal use. How are we feeling about those as new modes?
Rory, you take the first, and I'll take the second, maybe.
Fractional ownership. I think it's the first thing to remember which annoys me when people are anti-car is one of the reasons I support the electrification of the car is that you can miniaturize electric motors much more effectively than you can miniaturize internal combustion engines, and much less nastily. In fact, I was just watching a YouTube film about the fact that apparently quite a few Tour de France competitors had electric motors inside their bicycles at some point before the whole thing became a bit more stringent. You can make an electric motor very small and very elegant and very effective. And therefore, what a car, I often refer to car-like objects because in urban settings, the car probably shouldn't be a car. There's a system in San Antonio called the Local, which are little 6-person buses that travel around for free. They're human driven at the moment. They're funded by advertising revenue and by the fact that bars and restaurants pay to have a stop outside because it drives footfall. So it's an entirely free mode of electric transport. And they're very narrow. They're literally sort of 2 people wide. I think, what we'll have to do is effectively rethink the categorization of vehicles here. And so one important point is that Uber has been, and Waymo will be even more so, a complementary good to public transport rather than the competitor to a large extent. Because for last mile journeys, I think Christian Christian Walmart very good writer on this, which is that public transport works very well, but the last mile problem needs to be solved by something else. And I would argue that I travel to London. I used to drive into London if I went to a party because I didn't confidently believe I could get back to the railway station in time for my last train. With Uber, I now confidently believe, surge pricing aside, that I'll be able to get there, and so I go in by train. I think that the understanding this is why I think it's really vital that we're consumer focused, we're human focused first rather than network focused,
Mhm.
because the human problem is generally multimodal. I'd even extend it to my weirdest suggestion, which is I think the Department for Transport should give everybody in the UK premium Zoom access, because the best journey is one that people don't make because they don't need to. Now, in Finland, it's called Pete's right on this, isn't it? It's the Department for Transport and Connectivity. So they have a holistic view of how people connect, including both digital modes, non-physical modes, and physical modes. Funnily enough, Zoom were really, really interested in this idea of simply selling to a government in the same way that Dubai has given all its citizens Chat GPT.
Interesting.
And
Yeah.
and so that the holistic way of looking at this is to start with the question, well, and particularly true of commuting, is this journey really necessary? That's the first question. And secondly, is it really necessary to make this journey at peak time? Because one of the most important things about flexible work isn't necessarily working from home, it's working from home in the morning, going in the afternoon.
Mm.
And there's no such thing as an off-peak season ticket.
Yes,
So
we're doing some work in a combined with a combined authority at the moment, and that's something that's definitely been now looked at as, better solutions for those who are hybrid working, for those who
yeah,
are working different times, get things working better there. Fabulous. We've got a couple of more minutes. Coming back to behavior change, I mean, there's a couple of interesting ones here. How do we understand the difference between what people say in surveys will change their behavior and what actually changes their behavior? I mean, yes, oftentimes we do a lot of travel surveys and
the
response
intention action gap. Yeah,
responses come with
absolutely.
bias. Responses come with bias. So,
Yeah.
so how do we deal with that? And also, I guess, also related to that, what practical strategies can we use to drive meaningful behavior change when
Uh,
we're up against significant barriers?
a really vital fact about that, by the way, I discovered from most rail companies is when they research anybody, they automatically exclude a category of people they call rail rejectors, who are quite a large percentage of the population. And my argument is those rail rejectors could be converted if you just talk to them. And so, actually, probably the solution is to give them a good experience of an off-peak train journey, and 2 or 3 times a year, and you've solved the problem. And that's one of those classic mistakes where that's a stated intention. I'm never going to go anywhere by train. Generally, our attitudes proceed from our behaviour every bit as much, perhaps even more, than our behaviour proceeds from our stated attitudes.
Yeah. Yeah, and as much maybe I approach some of the answer to that question obliquely with the point about top down and bottom up. So there are things that people tell you, and there's things that people don't tell you. But in the book, we also mark the fact that traditional transport surveys very much follow the same line of questioning. So if the question comes to the fact that we're talking about things that people might not surface in the book, we have a small little section of a chapter called "Were Our Windows to Your Satisfaction?" Again, giving a train or a bus example, evidently the quality of the view out of the vehicle or the train is important to people, but never has a survey ever asked about the cleanliness of the windows. We leave it to people to surface that, but we will ask more direct questions that follow the same orthodoxy and paradigm of how we think. Same goes for data signal, that we don't yet really map or understand the quality of data signal.
It took me years to understand why I hated the old Thameslink trains until the new Thameslink trains came along, and I realized that the old Thameslink trains sat you at such a low level, your chin was about level with the bottom of the window, which both ruined the whole experience of the view and also made you feel like a small child. Okay. And it was, partly a status dignity thing, I think, and a lot of these things are tacit. It's worth noting they're felt, they're not thought. And that's why even conventional market research, valuable though it can be, doesn't get to that. I have a personal fantasy about getting rid of ticket barriers. I don't know how you do it, but so that you can stride through a station and board a train without that moment of indignity. Now, I'm sure people are
I
measuring.
think that's happening. I think there's stuff going on in Switzerland.
That would be fundamentally, it would just change the psychological experience of boarding a train. The film Brief Encounter would have been complete rubbish if they'd had ticket barriers, wouldn't it? Right?
Fantastic. Well, we've hit 11:30. There are many more questions which we will strive to come back with responses. There was one brilliant one here, which was about your talk about buses, and they should be emblazoned with where they're going. Really interesting point here about the fact that actually how much time is drivers spending telling people where the bus goes. The business case could be there just straight away, just looking at it. So
It drives me insane. I mean,
we've got
genuinely insane. Yeah.
there's a lot more to be done here in terms of really thinking through it as a system and being human-centered. So, Pete, Rory,
have we got a record of all the questions?
We do. We absolutely do. So
it does occur to me, if we've got a record of that, then we're not going to guarantee everything, and there are going to be things we don't know. But Pete and I could, over the next few weeks, just generally take those questions and just annotate them a bit. So
we will do that.
A bit of after sales service. Yeah.
And we'll get back to people individually as well. So again, Rory, Pete, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you, audience, for attending. We've had great people throughout. So thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.